Good afternoon, everyone. Does anyone have any questions before we start today? Okay, I guess not. So we have a few minutes before we start. So if anyone has anything, please let me know. Okay, good afternoon for everyone, especially who joined us late. Today, what we want to do, if no one has any questions, is, as I said last time, we're going to look at two countries from within the region, within the MENA region, that represent diverse political structures. In other words, the political system or the governing structure in each of this country is very much different. And this is something that we see all over in the MENA region. In other words, the political structure or the governmental systems in the region is highly diverse. So we find, for example, some countries that are republics and uh, led by presidents. And on the other hand, we find monarchies that have absolute kings. And we have also some sort of what we call principalities. In other words, not a full-fledged king, but rather a prince. That's why they're called principalities. And we have those in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Oman, in the United Arab Emirates. And the monarchies are basically Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, and Bahrain. Those are basically the four kingdoms. In other words, countries who are actually ruled by kings. And on both sides of the aisle, whether we're looking at kingdoms or we're looking at republics, both of them happen to be following or pursuing a governmental system that is pretty much autocratic. So in other words, you can't expect to see any type of political freedoms. Now, obviously, some countries happen to do that based on trying to get as much um, coalition amongst the people to actually come and respect and agree with whatever their leaders dictate to them. So it comes through co-optation. And on the other hand, you have some political systems or countries of the MENA region where disagreement or political settlements, if you will, comes through not co-optation, but rather through repression. So you have this two different types of governments that we see in the MENA region, but nonetheless, all of them lack democratic institutions, with the exception of a few. Nowadays, some countries are trying actually to bring the democratic process into the forefront. And some countries have tried to experiment with it, not because they like to, but simply because of the huge pressure that is placed upon them, whether domestically from within or from outside, from other countries that happen to have some sort of influence over the countries in question. So, these are some of the things that have been taking place recently, especially after the Arab uprising or the so-called Arab Spring that started in 2011 in Tunis, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with by now. So, you see some steps being taken by certain leaders to undergo certain political reforms, but very limited political reforms, so as to satisfy the outside world as well as those people inside, the citizens, in other words. And, it has worked in some countries and it has not worked in other countries. And this is a huge problem of why democracy has not worked in the MENA region. And then the reason, as we will see later, there are a lot of reasons, of course, but we will look at these reasons later on of why democracies, or at least the steps towards democratic rule, the steps towards the establishment of democratic institutions has not succeeded in the MENA region. Unfortunately. And again, as I said, we cannot say that some countries have not tried. Some countries have tried to actually take that route, especially countries like Morocco, Tunis, Jordan. These are the places, basically, Kuwait. Those are the places that you see there is a movement towards democratic rule, basically. In other words, giving more freedom to people to express themselves, giving the freedom to people to actually participate in the decision-making process. So there are a lot of openings in as far as the democratic process is concerned that these countries have obviously tried to implement. Now, as I said, in some countries it was very successful, and in other countries it was not as successful. And we will talk about some of these things as we go along today. Now, if we look at the republic countries in the MENA region, we will see that usually the leaders or the presidents of these authoritarian republics um, have found a way basically to legitimize their rule with giving out promises of uh, income redistribution, land reform, uh, social mobility, and very importantly here, that they have given the not, I don't want to say the hope, but they have given their citizens um, a nationalistic point of view of how uh, countries should be governed from a nationalistic point of view. In other words, they promise to actually have or make, if you will, radical reworking of the social order that has prevailed during colonial rule. And this is something that a lot of the citizens really like to see because they feel, hey, we've been occupied for so long. Now we really need to find where our identity is. And we need to cement that. So actually, these leaders, when they came to power after gaining independence, and most of them have been in power for that long, unless, of course, they die of natural reasons or whatever, but they have been in power ever since. Um, the hope that they're giving them is that, hey, we have a plan to actually uh, radicalize or completely eradicate the social order that existed during colonial times. In other words, we want to give you your identity back. We feel that your identity has been taken away from you during colonialism. Now we're going to promise you that we're going to bring that identity back to you. And a lot of countries have done that. However, a lot of the implementations and policies that were pursued in this direction sometimes were policies that did not work very well for the simple reason because they were, first of all, not well executed, they were not well planned, and sometimes they really went very, very far to the extreme. Now, just to give you an example, in Algeria, Algeria got their independence in 1962. And before that, they used to be quasi a French province, basically, even though it was far from France, but it used to be regarded as one part of France. That's how the French colonialists viewed Algeria, as part of France, basically. And they used to call it the 15th province. In other words, France had 14, so now Algeria has become the 15th province of France. And France actually ruled over Algeria for a very, very long time, and it was probably over 150 or 60 years of occupation. So most of the political, legal, educational, social, you name it, it's all French. Even the language, the official language was French. That's why nowadays you see a lot of Algerians are struggling with the Arabic language. A lot of them, especially the old generation in Algeria, can express themselves in French a lot more than they can in Arabic. So you can see the influence of colonialism. And the French obviously had a lot of their own people migrate to Algeria as farmers, as teachers, as civil servants. I mean, the French population in Algeria was pretty high. A lot of French people there. So now when Algeria got its independence, the first thing they wanted to do was to kick all the colonialists out of France. This is what I meant when I said the policies were a little bit too extreme. In other words, you're not going to do something like this because you're going to create a vacuum. And what are you going to do with that vacuum? Who's going to fill that vacuum? So, a lot of these things, it has to be done step by step. In other words, you can't just do everything at once. You have to use common sense. And sometimes, leaders played on the emotions of the people. And this is the wrong policies to use. But they felt, hey, since it's going to be accepted by the people and the people are going to really give us high marks for undertaking such an action, then we go ahead and do it. And that's exactly a huge mistake that the Algerian leaders made by simply expediting all the French that were in Algeria. So you had a lot of nurses, you had doctors, you had educators, teachers, you had farmers, you had engineers that worked in all aspects and all forms of the industrial structure in Algeria, namely those who were actually responsible for generating electricity, water, building roads. I mean, it all belonged to French companies, French businesses, and the French government were pretty much responsible for providing all public services. Now, when Algeria took its independence, they pretty much executed certain things, as I said before, that were haphazard and they were not based on logic at all. They were not very rational decisions. And all of this obviously left a vacuum in Algeria, and Algeria suffered as a consequence. So those are some of the things that we really need to look back at and see why a lot of these countries were not able to take off economically. And they really had to struggle for a while before they could put the pieces together, before they could, in fact, determine what is the best plan to use to get out of the predicament that they put themselves in. And that takes time. And this is one of the reasons, basically, why a lot of these countries were not able to do very well from the beginning. In other words, they did not have the right foundations to build on. The foundations that they built on were pretty much not well structured. And this obviously caused a lot of problems. And the same thing, what happened in Libya. Libya got its independence in 1951. Now, the Libyan king, King Idris, was very wise. So King Idris basically did not throw any Italians out of Libya. And Libya used to be pretty much run by Italian companies. In other words, all public services, electricity, water, again, everything else was pretty much produced by the Italians who actually lived in Libya for a long, long time, since Libya was invaded by Italy in 1911, and Libya got its independence in 1951. So you're talking about at least 40 years that the Italians were in Libya, and a lot of Italians were born in Libya. But the king didn't do anything and kept things going smoothly, and he did a good job. By the way, if you look at Libya after their independence from 1951 to 1969, that's when the king was deposed, overthrown by a military coup by Gaddafi in 1969. So the king actually ruled over Libya from 1951 to 1969. And bearing in mind that oil was discovered in Libya only in 1962, and they started pumping oil in 1963. So you can see from here that the king only had 6 years of oil revenues to work with. And before that, Libya had nothing. It was simply a barren desert, no resources whatsoever. But if you look at that period from 1951 to 1969, that period used to be referred to as the golden years of Libya. Why? Because you had someone at the helm, King Idris, who was, first of all, he was a nationalist. So he actually looked at the interests of the Libyan people. He put those interests at heart, and he really wanted to do the best for Libya. At the same time, he was a very shrewd politician and diplomat. He was able to get a lot of help from the Italian government, even though Italy is no longer occupying Libya. But he was able to actually maintain a lot of the Italians who were in Libya and to give them everything that they needed in order to persuade them to stay in Libya. And the Italians, obviously, you know, they had no problem with that because, as I said, a lot of them were born in Libya, and they simply felt Libya as their country, and they wanted to do whatever they could in order to help the Libyan economy. And this worked pretty well. In 1969, when you had this revolution, the military coup that was led by Colonel Gaddafi, Gaddafi decided to take a different route. And he wanted to throw all the Italians out of Libya. And he wanted everything to be Libyan. He wanted the Libyans to take care of everything inside Libya. But how are you going to do it? You can't just do it automatically. It's not going to happen automatically. You're going to need time to do that. You're going to need time to replace the civil service, to replace the professional engineers, etc., that were actually working in Libya. You're not going to do it immediately. But Gaddafi again fell into the same trap. And that is, he decided to throw all those people out, especially farmers, Italian farmers, who were pretty efficient and did an excellent job of producing for the agricultural sector. And now, you know, you have a complete vacuum. And as a result, instead of moving forward, now Libya is digressing and moving backward. And all of this is simply because of the domestic policies that were used were pretty much irrational. So that's basically what most of the presidents of the authoritarian republics in most of the countries in the MENA region banked on. And that is to completely rework, in other words, have a what we call a radical rework of the social and economic order that prevailed during the colonial era. So that was a huge mistake, and that's exactly what happened. Now, a lot of these countries in the MENA region, whether they are monarchs or republics, they based most of their policies on certain ideological principles. And in these ideological principles, whether they are socialist in form or whether they are more liberal and capitalist in form, it really doesn't matter. But there were these ideological principles that were portrayed by the leaders in both the monarchies and the republics, which, again, as I said, tried to work on the emotions of the people. Um, um, in a lot of these principles that were portrayed, they were simply more rhetorical than real. In other words, everything that was contained in these guiding principles that were portrayed by the leaders to their people, it was simply more rhetoric rather than actual things happening in the real world. And this was also another problem. However, both republics and monarchs pretty much invested heavily in the infrastructure um, and in services as well, which brought marked improvement in social development, as we will see in the next few chapters when we talk about human development. You see that countries, whether they are monarchies or republics, they invested heavily in human development. And But then again, we will see what the results were from all of these investments and what happened to those investments. We will talk about that when we look at it. But nevertheless, they actually pumped a lot of money. They put a lot of money into human development, into public services, into building infrastructure. However, again, you can't put all the countries of the MENA region in one basket, basically. I mean, they're so different in their policies, in their planning, in their execution, in their administration. It's mind-boggling to see why the difference, and also to see that most of these countries don't happen to learn from the mistakes of others, of other countries in the MENA region, or from the mistakes of their predecessors. And this is a huge problem as well. In other words, if you don't learn from your mistakes, and if you don't try to find better solutions, then obviously you're stuck and you will be mired in poverty. And there is no hope of advancement, progress. Uh, and that's basically really uh, what is happening in the MENA region. Um, again, we can see very clearly that the state as we defined it, the modern state as it is defined, uh, began to decline in the MENA region in the late 70s and 80s. And some of the reasons we already looked at, simply because of poor planning, uh, uh, unclear goals, uh, bad execution of plans. Most of the time, there is a lot of rhetoric rather than actual policies being implemented on the ground. So it's just rhetoric, it's just things that they feel that will make people happy by hearing what these leaders have in mind and what they want to do. It's basically rhetoric. Now, let's look at some of the things that, and here we're going to focus on two countries. We're going to focus on Egypt, which is a republic, and also Saudi Arabia, which is a monarchy. And we will try and see how these two countries proceeded in as far as um, governing is concerned, and in as far as putting policies together, planning, execution, the type of economic system that they have, and also the type of political system that they have. Now, obviously, the Arab republics usually used what we call Arab socialism to actually run their economy, their social and political systems through this concept of Arab socialism. Now, Arab socialism simply entails basically state ownership of all resources. In other words, all the economic strategies that were used in most of these Arab republics were pretty much socialist and populist, and were pretty much hostile to the private sector and also to foreign capital. So they really didn't do much to actually attract foreign capital. If any, they actually put a hindrance towards foreign capital coming in. So that's basically what Arab socialism is all about. And part of it, of course, has been borrowed from the Ataturk model. Remember what we said about the Ataturk model, where he felt that the government should be supreme and dominant in as far as the economic system is concerned. In other words, the government really has to provide a lot for the people. So basically, this is what Arab socialism is about. And then another thing, in as far as Arab socialism is concerned, is that profit and loss is basically not the primary criterion of in other words, it's not the criterion that is used to assess public sector performance. This is not how SOEs, state-owned enterprises, were evaluated. They were not evaluated based on the profits that they were making. So, in other words, it is the creation of jobs, provision of goods and services that were important, not the actual performance of those companies or public enterprises. It's not whether they are really using resources efficiently, whether they're making a profit. That's not how these companies were evaluated. They were evaluated simply based on the number of jobs that they were able to provide, and also the number of goods and services that they were able to provide to the public. This was basically the main criterion. So this is obviously very, very much different from a market system, from a capitalist system. So Arab socialism obviously is very much different. In other words, supply and demand was always considered to be inferior to government planning. Under Arab socialism, the market forces, demand and supply, were always considered to be very, very inferior to the government planning. So government planning really reigns supreme in economic activity. Large private sector is regarded as untrustworthy. So a lot of these governments were pretty much scared of promoting or subsidizing a large private sector. They did not mind to see a very, very small and fragmented private sector, because that really worked to their benefit. But to have a huge, efficient, well-structured, large private sector, that was something that really was viewed as a threat to the governing dictatorship. And as a result, you see in a lot of these Arab countries in the MENA region, the private sector is usually very small, ineffective, inefficient, and most of the jobs that it provides are pretty small. So it really has no power, if you will, over the citizens by providing them jobs. So most of the power really lies with the government. In other words, your livelihood is really with the government. So you can't afford to rock the boat, if you will, and as far as the government is concerned, you really want to be on the good side of the government. And that's one of the basic reasons why the MENA region has not done so well, simply because the private sector was completely neglected. And as a result, you end up with a very small, inefficient private sector. So those are simply some of the things that I thought were important to actually, and then again, when we talk about foreign capital, they really didn't do much to actually attract foreign capital, and there is a reason for that. In other words, foreign investment was usually viewed with suspicion. In other words, a lot of these um, republic presidents or autocrats, if you will, or dictators, call them whatever you want, they were very, very fearful of outside investment for the simple reason because they felt that if they allow that, then their power will be completely limited. Or they will see some sort of regression in as far as their power is concerned. And they really didn't want to let go of all the power that they have in the country. They don't want to share it with anyone, not domestically, not internationally. They want to be the ones that call the shots all the time. They want to be the ones that hire and fire, basically. And for that reason, foreign investment was viewed with a lot of suspicion. And
Professor?
yes.
So would you say that's why they also felt threatened by the private sector development? Is it the same reason they wanted to stay in control? Is this why they never worked on expanding it?
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons. There you have it. Yeah, you got the reason right there. That's one of the reasons why they didn't want to encourage the private sector, because they looked at the private sector as a threat to their control over the population. In other words, if the private sector was vibrant and was huge and was providing a lot of jobs, then people are really not going to depend on the government to provide them jobs. And they don't have to be on the good side of the government simply because they know that they're not threatened with their jobs, basically, because their jobs lie somewhere else. So this is basically one of the reasons why the MENA region did not do so well. In other words, governments were pretty much interested in foreign capital only in as far as undertaking turnkey projects. In other words, they will welcome foreign capital if they will start a project and at the end of the day provide the government with the turnkey, if you will. In other words, now everything is ready for you. Go ahead, you give us our money, we are out, and now you do whatever you want to do. These are known as turnkey projects, basically. And management contracts obviously were permitted as well. In other words, you have a contract for managerial skills purposes that we need to get from you. And once you have trained enough of the people that we have, then, we're going to tell you goodbye. And that's about it. So management contracts were pretty much permitted. And there was a condition that foreign investors who come to establish this so-called turnkey projects will never have the ability to acquire any equity. You can't acquire equity. So you do your job and you're out of here, basically. That's it. You have nothing else to do. I mean, you're really no longer connected with that project anymore. Once you submit the key, once you give us the key, at the end of the day, that's it. Your job is done, it's complete, and we don't know you, you don't know us, basically. That's how it's done. So those are simply some of the things that I thought were important to give you a prelude to basically what's going on in some countries in the MENA region that are obviously republics in nature, and they have presidents who are autocrats and dictators, and who happen to be pursuing a policy of Arab socialism. And again, one good example of this would be Egypt under President Nasser. President Nasser, of course, was a junior officer, and he was involved in a military coup to depose King Farouk of Egypt in 1951. So Egypt used to be a monarchy, but in 1951, no longer a monarchy. It was transformed into a republic, and President Nasser played a key role in the overthrowing of King Farouk. Basically, when President Nasser came to power, he was pretty much, in 1951 actually, he was, he had a role obviously, and some say that he had the dominant role, if you will, in the overthrow of King Farouk, but he really didn't want to come up with his name simply because he felt that, hey, what happens if the coup fails? Then obviously they're going to bring my neck and hang me in the Tahrir Square. And, you know, I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to keep underground. And if it's successful, then I come out. If it fails, then hey, nobody knows anything about me. So everything was kept secret, basically, who the leaders, the ringleaders are. And, but, you know, when the coup became successful and everyone knew that everything went according to plan and the king was deposed, then obviously President Nasser came out into the open and proclaimed the republic, the Arab Republic of Egypt, if you will, in 1952. Now, President Nasser was very successful, by the way, in sweeping the political arena, not only in Egypt, but in the whole Arab world clean during that era. Now, why was that? Why do you think would people support a dictator like President Nasser? President Nasser obviously was a dictator. I mean, he pretty much ruled over Egypt by himself, basically. Now, he established a single party, which he called the ASU, the Arab Socialist Union Party. And this party was basically formed on functional lines. You know, when I say functional lines, basically what I mean by that is you know, when the party is formed, it's formed based on intellectuals, workers, peasants, soldiers, national capitalists, educators, so all on functional lines. You know, in other words, on occupations, on functions, what each citizen has to do in society. What's his or her function in society? What are they doing? basically? Are they farmers? Are they educators? Are they engineers? Are they army officers? Are they national capitalists? Now, all of these basically became members of the ASU. All of them became members of the ASU. So the party, we say, is basically formed on functional lines. Functional lines. And the rhetorical emphasis here for this party and for President Nasser, in other words, the key words that obviously made the people more attracted to the party is basically the rhetorical emphasis was put on unity, on cohesion, and devotion to the national cause. And now, the national cause as defined by the state. So this is basically the key words. These are basically the rhetorical emphasis that the ASU was pretty much focused on: unity, cohesion, and devotion. Again, unity, cohesion, and devotion to the national cause as defined by the state. That's basically what the Arab Socialist Union was based on. And then class division is to be resolved through the redistribution of wealth. And this was another thing that President Nasser played upon: redistribution of wealth. Because during the Farouk era, King Farouk of Egypt, there is a huge gap between the poor and the rich. Now, the rich were very few, but they pretty much owned close to 90% of the Egyptian economy, basically. And they were what? They were 10% owning 90%, and 90% of the population owning 10%. So you can see this huge gap between the haves and have-nots. And President Nasser was astute politician, and he knew exactly on what chords to play, basically. And he felt that this was a winning situation for him by telling the people that he is interested in redistributing income and making sure that there will be some sort of just distribution. So class division, according to President Nasser, should be resolved through the redistribution of wealth with state policies, like, for example, land reform, heavy investment in human capital. All of this, basically, what President Nasser embarked on, land reform, which was a huge success in Egypt. In other words, it really gave a lot of incentives to Egyptian farmers to toil the land, not like before. They became very efficient, and agricultural production increased tremendously as a result of these land reforms that were imposed by President Nasser. That's number one. Number two, heavy investment in education. And this also helped the Egyptian population tremendously in terms of social mobility. So the more education you have, the more opportunities you have for better jobs. The less education you have, the less opportunity you're going to have. So this is one of the things that President Nasser was very successful in, was to really put a lot of investment, put a lot of emphasis on human development. And he did that. And he was very successful. And this obviously led to significant social mobility among the poor and the urban segments of the population. Now, obviously, President Nasser went even further than that. In fact, if you look at the projects that President Nasser embarked on, and by the way, one of the things that President Nasser learned was from the Russian president that he visited in 1956. He went to Russia to visit um, the president of Russia, President Khrushchev at the time. And President Nasser, during his state visit, he was extremely overtaken by what he saw. In other words, Russia just came out of the Second World War. In other words, the war ended in 1945, and Russia was pretty much decimated during the war. They lost quite a bit. And when President Nasser visited Russia, which is 10 years after them coming out of the war, and he was extremely, extremely surprised to see the advances that Russia made. So, he sat down with President Khrushchev and he told him, you know what, I want you to send me your planners and everyone who was actually responsible for putting Russia together in the way that I see it right here in terms of factories, roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, you name it. This is what I want to see in Egypt. And, President Khrushchev took a few minutes to reply. And then he told him, you know what, Mr. President, all what you see right now, this is not difficult to do. It's not difficult to build these things. He said the most difficult thing to do is not to build schools, factories, but to build the human being, to build the person that's going to be building these things for you. So you really got to start from there. And that's something that resonated in Nasser's head. And when he went back to Egypt, the first thing he did was to basically focus on education, put so much investment in education, training, etc. And he was able to do a good job. And why? Why was he able to do a good job? By simply looking at what President Nasser was able to accomplish during his power, which really did not last for long because he was, he died. He wasn't assassinated, as some people would say. Those are just rumors. But he died a natural cause in 1970. So, he was there in power for close to about maybe 18, 19 years. Take or give a few years here and there, but, it's not a long period of time when you measure it against what other leaders were facing when they were actually in power. But anyway, the two things that President Nasser was very famous for and will probably be remembered forever in Egypt is the building of the Aswan Dam. Huge project that cost Egypt a lot of money. And Egypt being a poor country, in other words, it's resource poor, labor abundant, the population of Egypt today is probably about 100 million. So, as far as population is concerned, it has a huge population, but it's a poor country in terms of resources. So Egypt, during the era of President Nasser, he was very much interested in the Aswan Dam project because the Aswan Dam project will hit two birds with one stone. First of all, it will provide a lot of water for farmers, for Egypt as a whole, which is very, very important. You know, water, I mean, you know, if you have water, you have everything. If you don't have water, you have a problem. So water is pretty much one of the most necessary items that countries must always safeguard. And then electricity. So two of these things were pretty much provided by the Aswan Dam. And the Aswan Dam project obviously generated electricity and ensured an ample supply of water to the agricultural sector in terms of irrigation and what have you. So that really cost a lot of money, and Egypt did not have the money. Egypt tried to get some foreign investors to come in and invest. However, the US government at the time stood against that for the simple reason because they felt that President Nasser, first of all, was following socialist policies, and second of all, President Nasser happens to be uh, inclined towards the Soviet Union at the time more. And when we know that there was a tug of war, if you will, between the West and the East, the West led by the US and the East led by the Soviet Union, then obviously you know that the US is really not going to be very excited in putting any sort of investment in Egypt. And so President Nasser had to turn to the Soviet Union. Obviously, at the time, the Soviet Union, you know, they didn't have much money themselves, but they were able to scrap from here and there. And the Aswan Dam was a successful project. And it lives till this day today. In other words, without the Aswan Dam, Egypt today would be in a very precarious situation. So they owe a lot of thanks to President Nasser, who had the foresight and the fortitude to actually begin on such a strategic and important project like that of the Aswan Dam. And it's a beauty, by the way. You can Google it and just see the structure of the Aswan Dam itself. It's just a beauty, remarkable project. And then the next thing that President Nasser did was to build the iron and steel complex, huge iron and steel. In other words, he really wanted to industrialize Egypt, basically. So on the one hand, he was focusing on agriculture and he was doing everything he could in terms of land reforms, in terms of promoting the agricultural sector, in terms of subsidies, low taxes, etc. So he was doing all of this for the agricultural sector to make sure that the agricultural sector can stand on its feet, which is a good thing. That's what you need to do. You need to have balanced growth. And President Nasser was able to do a good job of adhering to the balanced growth principle, agriculture on the one hand and industrialization on the other hand. So the first thing he did was he really started with the iron and steel complex at Helwan, Helwan, Helwan. So if you Google that, it will give you a picture of that huge industrial project. And we're talking about the 60s here. So, you know, we're not talking recent. This is close to 60 years ago. So obviously, President Nasser was on the right track, and he did an excellent job of building that huge iron and steel complex at Helwan. And then he also built a large fertilizer plant at Aswan, another city, Aswan. That's where the Aswan Dam is. So he made sure that a large fertilizer plant is built, which would obviously help farmers and the agricultural sector. And then again, as I said, he implemented land reforms which redistributed large estates to small farmers. Um, and he embarked on the first 5-year industrial plan. Very important. The first 5-year industrial plan, which began in 1957 and ended in 1962, with strong emphasis on state enterprise. So President Nasser was very, very fond of state enterprises because he felt that the private sector in Egypt is so weak that it really doesn't have the resources to start building these huge enterprises. And it is only the state that can actually take the risk and put the resources towards these huge projects. And his strategy basically worked in Egypt, and he was able to make a lot of progress. In other words, if you look at the Egyptian economy during the 1960s and 1970s, from the point of view of industrialization and agricultural production, it was actually very, very strong and sound. In other words, Egypt was pretty much producing a variety of consumer products. It also embarked on assembling cars. So they actually built a huge car assembly where they would assemble cars. And they actually named those cars after President Nasser. So there is the Nasser car. Like today you have Toyota, you have Tesla or whatever. I mean, at the time, Egypt or most of the Egyptians were driving cars that were Nasser cars, just named after the president, who obviously had a huge impact on auto assembly in Egypt. And then, you had a lot of assembly structures for TV sets, for dishwashers, for washers and dryers, radios. A lot of these things were actually produced in Egypt. Nowadays, for example, if you look at the Egyptian economy, in as far as production is concerned, very, very weak. Not many factories. There isn't. During the Nasser's era, you would find so many factories. You would find the Egyptian economy really doing extremely well in terms of production, both on the agricultural and on the industrial side. So from this, we can't say that President Nasser did not do a good job. And for that reason, his popularity grew, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world, because he was one of the advocates of Arab union, Arab nationalism. He felt that instead of having all these 18 countries spread out, why not have one country and call it the um, Arab Republic Union? This is something that Nasser had in mind. It's simply to combine all these 18 Arab countries into just one. And he said, if we are successful in doing that, then economically we're going to be very strong, politically very strong, and socially very strong. And unfortunately, he was never able to get all the Arab countries to form a union together. Not political, but also economic. He was not able to get an economic union or even a customs union uh, between the Arab countries. So he failed in that approach. And the reason, of course, is simply because other leaders did not trust President Nasser. They felt that President Nasser was pretty much interested in political power. He was interested in becoming the leader of all the Arab countries. And he was interested in dismantling all monarchs and turning them into republics. And for that reason, he failed to actually get all those countries to move in one direction. But, those are some of the things that um, President Nasser was not able to achieve, even though he pretty much wanted to take that route. Um, Now, the failure of Arab nationalism, of course, is a guiding principle, persuaded President Sadat, who actually took over from President Nasser, to embark on a new strategy. And he said that, hey, what President Nasser was doing is completely wrong, and we're going to start all over again. This is another mistake in the MENA region. They don't know how to build on things that they already have and improve on them. Everyone feels that they are the big shot and they're going to do it their own way and they're going to dismantle everything that existed before. This is a big mistake. This is a huge mistake in the MENA region. And Arab leaders in the MENA region have to learn how to start building on whatever they have, restructuring, making changes here and there, but not dismantling. Because when you dismantle something, it's very, very difficult to start something new. It's very easy to destroy, but it's very difficult to build. Unfortunately, Arab leaders have not learned from those mistakes. And this is a huge problem. So Sadat basically dismantled everything that Nasser did, and he wanted to start anew. And one of the things that he wanted to do was to actually transform the economy, the Egyptian economy, from a socialist to a capitalist, if you will, even though he was not able to do that in full force. But he started with what we call limited economic liberalization. And the term that was given by Sadat at the time was infitah. Infitah in Arabic means opening. In other words, he wanted to open the Egyptian economy to the rest of the world in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of trade, you name it. So he wanted to have some sort of limited economic liberalization. And as a result, what happened was that the trade class became very powerful in Egypt. In other words, those who were involved in imports and exports became a potent force in Egypt. And they brought crony capitalism with them. And that obviously made a lot of problems for the Egyptian economy. And President Sadat also, he wanted to permit more room for civil liberty. So he allowed some independent political parties to operate. So instead of having a single political system, now President Sadat left the door open for many parties to form, many different political parties to form, with the exception, of course, of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist party, political party, that obviously was not allowed for many reasons, which we will talk about when we get to them in the last chapter, chapter 12, I believe, or 13. And the reason why President Sadat wanted to allow political parties to form is because he wanted to break the influence of the ASU. So he wanted to see a lot of competing forces with the ASU. In other words, he did not want to see the ASU as a monopoly anymore. And so he was encouraging the formation of different political parties. He even, by the way, gave freedom to Islamists to move around, but not to form political party. And the reason is simply because he felt that they will work as a stabilizing force against the ASU. So, he made a lot of decisions, President Sadat, which some of them worked and some of them didn't. And, we're really not going to be able to go over everything. As you can see, we're supposed to be going over with Saudi Arabia right now. But we will try to do that, even though, there's so much that we can say about President Sadat and what he did and his strengths and his weaknesses. Obviously, he was assassinated by a member of the Muslim Jihad, the Jihad party, which obviously President Sadat pretty much opened the door for them to prosper and to grow, hoping that they will form a balancing force with the ASU, but unfortunately that member of the Islamist Jihad was the one that was responsible for the assassination of President Sadat. And the reason for the assassination is because they felt that President Sadat was a traitor to the Arab cause by signing a peace agreement with Israel when Israel has not given an inch back of territory to the Palestinians. So they felt, hey, Israel didn't do anything, so why should we credit them by signing a peace treaty with them? And, if you talk to a lot of Arabs today, they'll probably have the same opinion. Things are changing a little bit, especially in the GCC now, as far as Israel is concerned. But on the whole, the Arab people, they simply distrust Israel. And, there is no respect for Israeli policies, or there is most of the Arab people are pretty much bent against Israeli policies in the Middle East, basically, and they're not willing to sit down with Israel because they feel that no matter what the Arabs would do, Israel is really not going to give an inch. And Israel obviously has occupied a huge chunk of the Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. They were able to give up most of the Egyptian territory that they occupied during the wars, but when it comes to Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, even though Jordan has signed a peace agreement with Israel, but the Israelis are still owning part of the East Bank of Jordan, as well as the West Bank. So again, probably we will have some time to talk about this also. But in the meantime, for the 5 minutes that we have left, let's pretty much summarize Saudi Arabia very quickly. Now, Saudi Arabia obviously is a monarch. It's ruled by a king. And it has actually been ruled by kings since its inception. That's why it carries the name Saudi. In other words, Saudi Arabia, basically the name is after the founder, Abdul Aziz al-Saud, Saud Saudi. That's what Saudi Arabia, or the name, comes from, basically the name of the king that founded the country. And it's a rich country, of course, and it's part of the resource-rich labor poor. The high per capita income enables Saudi Arabia basically to cushion most of the effects of economic shocks on their citizens. They also managed to minimize the negative economic consequences of the oil curse. Um, they were able to promote um, global competition and also promote globally competitive firms. And as a result, were able to establish economic efficiency simply by attracting all of these global firms into Saudi Arabia. They were able to establish economic efficiency for the domestic firms as well. They have learned very quickly from the previous oil shocks of the 80s to save more and spend less. Now, Saudi Arabia has pretty much implemented austerity programs, meaning less spending, more savings. And they are able to restrict political voice and resort less to repression by simply sharing more of the country's wealth. In other words, you see that education is subsidized, hospitals are subsidized, um, roads, freeways are free. You don't have to pay anything to use any of those. Water is subsidized, electricity is subsidized, fuel is subsidized. So, when everything is subsidized, obviously people are not going to stand and demonstrate against you. So they were able to keep the population basically quiet. And again, Saudi Arabia is the largest oil producer in the region. The royal family maintains power directly through co-optation and maintaining strong alliances with the West. So this is something else that really brings stability to Saudi Arabia, is of its close association with the West. It was able to actually maintain this alliance with the West. And as a result, the West have a stake in Saudi Arabia, and they're obviously not willing to see any social turmoil in Saudi Arabia. So any social turmoil will be crushed immediately. So Saudi Arabia basically occupies a crucial geopolitical significance in the US strategic interests. And this is one important reason. Recently, the monarchy has come under pressure to pursue some liberal reforms. But again, the prince right now, Prince Mohammed, Mohammed bin Salman, has tried to actually bring a few reforms, especially when it comes to women's rights, driving a car, because in Saudi Arabia, women were not allowed to drive a car. So now, the Prince of Saudi Arabia is trying to make certain reforms, not political, only social and economic, but not political. Political, he's not going to mess with that. And he was successful in certain liberal reforms that he instituted. Since 2011, Saudi Arabia obviously has played an influential counter-revolutionary role in the region by effectively stopping the overthrow of its allies, such as Bahrain, another kingdom, and also supporting Egypt against the Muslim Brotherhood. And also bankrolling the opposition that's fighting the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. They are the ones who actually bankrolled the fighting opposition. So obviously Saudi Arabia is playing a role, even though they like to call it a clean role, but you can't be calling other people's intervening in other countries as bad and call your own intervention as good. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Now you look at Iran and you say, well, why is Iran meddling in Lebanon? And why is Iran meddling in Yemen? But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is doing the same. So you really can't complain about Iranian intervention.
Professor?
Yes.
It's 2:15 already.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so we will leave it right there and hopefully we'll continue next time.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone has any questions?
For the test, you said it's gonna be a essay type test where you give us questions, right?
Right.
Okay. And you're gonna be picking examples like the Egypt example, like the Saudi Arabia example,
Right.
like this Lebanon example, for us
Exactly.
to talk about.
Right. Right. Those are simply some of the questions that you may see. Absolutely.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Bye, Professor.
All right. Take care now.
Professor, quick question.
Yes.
You said so Iran is meddling in Lebanon and
Yemen.
Yemen. So Saudi Arabia is it meddling in Syria? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is not only meddling in Syria, it's meddling in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, everywhere else, basically. In Bahrain, I mean, you know, Bahrain was about to fall if it wasn't for the support of Saudi Arabia. So, you know, you can't be accusing other countries of meddling when you are doing exactly the same. This is the point I was trying to get across.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, so I have another class, so I need to run, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Take care,
Thank you,
everyone.
Professor.
Have a nice weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.